Hello everyone, I am Andrea Solis, and I'm so excited today to be able to discuss Alzheimer's disease and spread more awareness about what the disease is. So, in our day-to-day lives, we don't think about how our brains work, right? However, when someone has Alzheimer's disease, it affects all of their daily tasks. In the brain, the parts that are affected by Alzheimer's are the entorhinal cortex and the hippocampus. So, the entorhinal cortex, which is located in the temporal lobe, is the gateway for information entering and leaving the hippocampus. So then the hippocampus, which is located in the inner medial region of the temporal lobe, they forms a part of the limbic system, which is important in regulating those emotional responses. So the hippocampus is involved in storing long-term memories, making those memories resistant to forgetting, and it also plays an important role in the spatial processing and the navigation. However, as the Alzheimer's becomes more severe, the cerebral cortex is also affected. So the cerebral cortex is located at the outer surface of the brain, and it's divided into two hemispheres. So the right and the left brain. If you've ever heard, oh, I'm left brain. Yeah, that's so. It's separated by a large sulcus called the medial longitudinal fissure. So the two hemispheres are connected via bundles of nerve fibers called the corpus callosum. So that allows both of the hemispheres of the cerebral cortex to work together, and it creates this environment for higher level processes such as consciousness and thought, emotion, reasoning, language, and memory. So now we're talking a little bit about the anatomy. So Alzheimer's disease causes the development of harmful plaques. So these plaques, they kill the neurons in your brain, which causes a portion of the brain to shrink, beginning in the hippocampus. So one of these plaques being the beta amyloid protein. So this comes in several different molecular forms, but they collect between neurons. So it is formed from the breakdown of a larger protein called the amyloid precursor protein. So one form is the beta amyloid 42, which is especially toxic. In the Alzheimer's brain, and normal levels of this naturally occurring protein, they clump together, they form plaques that collect between neurons, and then they disrupt the cell function. So another harmful plaque that causes Alzheimer's is the neurofibrillary tangles. So the neurofibrillary tangles are abnormal accumulations of a protein called tau. So that collects inside neurons. In Alzheimer's disease, abnormal chemical changes caused tau to detach from the microtubules and stick to other tau molecules. So later on, when I talk about tau tangles, this is what I'm talking about. They form their threads that eventually join, and then they form these tau tangles inside of the neurons. So what does a healthy anatomy versus Alzheimer's anatomy look like, right? So a healthy anatomy, the neurons have three basic parts: the cell body, the multiple dendrites, and an axon. So the cell body contains the nucleus, which houses the genetic blueprint that directs and it regulates the cell's activities. Then the dendrites are branch-like structures that extend from the cell body, and then they collect those information from other neurons. So the axon is a structure at the end of the cell body, and it transmits these messages to other neurons. So these parts of the brain are particularly important, and there are different ways to support the brain's functions. But in Alzheimer's disease, with the buildup of all these harmful plaques, many of the neurons just stop functioning. They lose the connection with other neurons, and then they die. So what's the physiology about it? So at first, the Alzheimer's disease, it typically destroys the neurons and their connections in parts of the brain involved in memory, so including the entorhinal cortex and the hippocampus. It later affects these areas in the cerebral cortex, which are responsible for the language, the reasoning, the social behavior. So eventually, many of the other parts of the brain end up being damaged. So, however, Alzheimer's disrupts processes that they are important to the neurons and their networks, which include the communication, metabolism and the repair. And as we discussed in the anatomy section earlier, through these harmful plaques, the neurons are just injured and they die throughout the brain, which then affects the connections between the neurons the network of neurons and causes them to end up breaking down, and many of these brain regions begin to shrink. So by the final stages of Alzheimer's, there's brain atrophy, which occurs, and it causes this huge, significant loss of brain volume. So that's what happens. So what's the healthy physiology versus the Alzheimer's physiology? So the healthy neurons, they're supported internally by these structures called microtubules. So these microtubules help guide the nutrients and molecules from the cell body to the axon and the dendrites. So in healthy neurons, the tau binds to and they stabilize the microtubules. So Alzheimer's is different from how the normal body reacts, because in Alzheimer's disease, the abnormal chemical changes causes the tau to detach from the microtubules and stick to other tau molecules. So they form these threads that eventually join together and form these tangles inside the neurons. So which later on, it leads on to the tangles blocking the neuron's transport system, which harms the synaptic communication between these neurons. So, the diagnosis, there are numerous amounts of early signs and symptoms of Alzheimer's disease that can be identified early on, including memory impairment, such as, difficulty remembering events, difficulty concentrating, planning or problem solving, and finishing daily tasks at home or work. Confusion with location and time, and having these visual or spatial difficulties, so such as not understanding where you're driving or getting lost or misplacing items, language problems such as word finding problems. And then you'll really notice with the reduced vocabulary in speech and writing, they're not talking the same. They're not able to have these long conversations with you that you used to have, and that also causes, they start withdrawing from work events or social engagements. They have these changes in mood. There's a large link to, having depression while you have Alzheimer's, and it could definitely be an earlier sign to seeing some of those things. So some of the things that they're able to use, the doctors are able to use, especially neurologists, so they're able to use for examinations. They can be diagnosed by a neurologist through mental examinations. So in these examinations, they'll evaluate whether there is, impaired memory or thinking skills, whether they, have these changes in personality or behaviors that we talked about before, and if there's a degree of what degree the memory or the thinking impairment changes, and how their thinking has been affecting them in their day-to-day lives, and maybe what are some of the causes, some of these symptoms that they're having before we completely rule in Alzheimer's. So there are also brain imaging technologies that are used in conjunction with the neurologist. So they use magnetic resonance imaging, which is, an MRI, and an MRI uses powerful radio waves and magnets to create a detailed view of your brain. And there's also the CT scan, the computerized tomography, which uses X-rays to obtain those cross-sectional images of your brain, which is important because there's obviously going to be a major shift in how the brain usually is. And there's also the PET scan. So the PET scan uses the positron emission tomography uses a radioactive substance known as a tracer to detect some of these substances in the body. So definitely the neurologists use all of those different brain imaging technologies in conjunction with their usual examinations. So some of the causes, their old age does not cause Alzheimer's. But it is the most important known factor for the disease. So the number of people with Alzheimer's disease doubles about every 5 years beyond the age of 65. So about 1/3 of all people age 85 and older may have Alzheimer's disease. People's genes, which are inherited from their biological parents, can affect how likely they are to develop the Alzheimer's disease. There is a possibility, as further research has been tested, that there is a relationship between cognitive decline and vascular conditions such as heart disease, stroke and high blood pressure, as well as metabolic conditions such as diabetes and obesity. So making sure that we keep ourselves in track is really important. So There's also early onset versus late onset. So, most people with Alzheimer's we've seen, they have a late onset. So these are the symptoms that become apparent in their mid-60s. So this is the most common type, but researchers have not found a specific gene that directly causes the late onset form of disease. However, one genetic risk factor is having one form or allele of the apolipoprotein E. So the gene is on the chromosome 19. It does increase a person's risk. So there's also the early onset Alzheimer's disease, which occurs between a person's 30s to mid-60s and represents less than 10% of all people. So with that have Alzheimer's. So again, it's very, very rare, and it's usually caused from genes passing down from a parent. So in Alzheimer's disease, the main system that is affected is the nervous system. As you can tell, this is because parts of the brains degenerate, so which the brain is a part of the nervous system. Because of this, there's destroying nerve cells and reduction of the responsiveness of the remaining ones to many of the chemical messengers that transmit these signals between nerve cells in the brain. So the level of acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter that helps with memory, learning, and concentration, is low. So since the nervous system controls the messages that are being sent to the entire body, the Alzheimer's has the power to affect the way that most systems are able to carry out their processes due to them not getting their necessary signals. So, for example, the digestive system not understanding when they need to release excrement. So, again, really the nervous system affects everything. So, definitely important to note that. So, going into treatment options. So before we talk about this, we need also, I'm going to let out a disclaimer that although these are used for treatment options, they work best for people in the earlier mid stages of Alzheimer's. So it's also important to note that none of the medications available at this time will cure Alzheimer's. So some options that we have are disease-modifying drugs. So that's aducanumab. So that is a disease-modifying medication currently approved to treat Alzheimer's. So this medication is a human antibody that targets the protein beta amyloid, and it helps to reduce those amyloid plaques. So another medication that is used is a medication known as memantine. So that is prescribed to treat moderate to severe Alzheimer's disease, and the drug's main effect is to decrease the symptoms, which could enable some people to maintain certain daily functions a little longer than they would without the medication. So this medication is able to lessen the symptoms that occur, but it doesn't cure the disease. There's also the donepezil, the rivaroxaban, and the cholinesterase inhibitors, which essentially do the same thing, which is prevent the breakdown of the acetylcholine in the brain. So as you can see in the diagram over here, that it is the progression of the tau tangles in an individual patient's brain by treatment. So on the right, you can see that there's much lower chance for these tau tangles to occur while using the aducanumab. So, moving on, the preventative measures. So the exact cause of Alzheimer's disease is unknown. So there's no real way that we can prevent the condition, but a healthy lifestyle can help reduce your risk. Cardiovascular disease has been linked with an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. So some preventative steps you can take are stopping smoking, keeping that alcohol to a minimum, eating a healthy, balanced diet with fruits and vegetables and exercising. And there's also some evidence to suggest that rates of dementia are lower in people who remain mentally and socially active throughout their lives. So ways you can do this is by reading, learning foreign languages, and playing musical instruments, volunteering, taking part in group sports, trying new activities or hobbies, and maintaining an active social life. So thank you so much for listening, everybody. These are my cited pages if you'd like to read them as well. Have a lovely day, and do not forget to stay safe, mask up, and sanitize often.